So our first speaker, Miss Tonia Garnett. She's a friend of Blue Stallion. We met her now just over a year ago, right? How time flies, it's crazy. We met her coming to meet Miss Juanita Shanks from Failsafe in our media recording studio for their podcast that Juanita had been doing, Stories from the Other Side. For those of you who don't know Juanita and Failsafe, they are a second chance organization. They go into the prisons and help teach individuals that are getting ready to come back to society from incarceration, to not just get on their own 2 feet, but to really do the deep work with them to try and help make sure that they don't end up back into those situations and back into prison. And she was one of the first partnerships that Blue Stallion created in service to our community, and we had done some training with their agents of change, and opened up the media studio, and they were doing this podcast. And Shindell was doing all the editing and stuff for that podcast, and so I was never in the room with those podcasts, but through the process I would listen to and hear all of these stories that these individuals were talking about coming out of that room. And Tonia's, oh my goodness, right? I could not believe the power in what I heard in that episode. And she has done and is working hard to do so many fantastic things for our community and beyond, right? She wrote a book. She'll talk to you about that. Enough is Enough. She's been going back and speaking. She's gotten certifications to help folks who are recovering, and she wants to do more, right? And she's becoming a huge advocate, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say likely lobbyist at some point, right? To really make major change here, nationwide, I think, but that's all to come. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Miss Tonia Garnett. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good luck.
Thank you.
Amazing.
I shouldn't be alive, some might say. On July 4th, 2021, I was shot and left for dead. The first bullet rang out. It hit my shoulder first. It entered my neck. You'll notice the scar in the neck in the picture. And it moved up the jugular. It lodged in my jaw, shattering my jaw. The second bullet rang out. It went clean through my right hand. And I was left in confusion. I asked myself, did he just shoot me? But before I can answer that question, I was falling. I hit the pavement and everybody ran. Remember, it's July 4th. It's 2:00 in the afternoon, broad daylight. Families are cooking out. They're outside. Everybody ran and I was alone. Now, here I stand, and I would love to tell you that through this experience and the fact that I'm alive, I had some sort of epiphany of the value of life. But I didn't, not at that time. Because I was an addict. I was addicted to crack cocaine. And let me tell you something about addiction that you may not be aware of. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, I'd like to be an addict today. Nobody wants to lose their finances and their family and their friendships and their profession. It doesn't happen that way. Addiction will take you farther than you're willing to go, and it will cost you more than you're willing to pay. Now that year, it would be easy to hear about this tragic event and think it was the worst thing that happened to me. But it was not. 1 month and 4 days after I was shot and left for dead, my best friend, my 29-year-old daughter, was killed in a head-on collision. That broke me. It nearly destroyed me. It shook me to the core. And that is still something I'm forever grateful that I rose out of. And I would be amiss if I stood here and told you about this other tragic event and didn't tell you that there was a miracle in the moment. My 2-year-old grandson was in that very same vehicle with her that day. And every inch of that vehicle was crushed and dented, nearly destroyed, except for the door which led to the car seat that baby was sitting in. So nobody can tell me that there wasn't a miracle that occurred that day. But the thing is, I couldn't see that then. Grief will sometimes be like a camera that the lens just zooms in so close on what you have lost that you can't possibly see what's left behind. So at that time, I could not see the miracle in the moment. But something changed a long time in me that allowed me to see that. My mind shifted where I could see that this awesome grandson of mine, who is 7 today, was truly a miracle. And something shifted about the addiction that I had gone through, and it made me look toward the future, not backward. Something shifted about all of the traumas, some of which I'll talk about today, and my mindset completely shifted. And I've said this before, and I'll say it many times again. If you can change your mindset, you can change your entire life. There was another place that changed my life. And it wasn't the hospital after the shooting. It wasn't the shooting itself. It wasn't even my daughter's funeral. It was inside a 6x9 jail cell. I was in that jail cell because I was arrested for possession of that very same drug that I was addicted to. Because that drug, it had me chained to it. Like a ball in a chain, I kept running back to the very thing that was destroying my life. But now I'm in a 6x9. And there's nothing but me, myself, and I. And I don't know about you, but it was really hard for me to sit and be alone with myself. I actually didn't particularly like myself when I first got alone with myself. And, I'm sitting there and all is quiet and finally in my mind, because I've learned to refer to this as an unintentional pause. This unintentional pause allowed me to be without distractions, without a phone, without responsibilities, and without the things that continue to bleed from the inside out. And when I talk about bleeding, I'm not talking about physically bleeding. I'm talking about emotionally, spiritually, mentally. And as I sat there with myself, I was able to take the time to examine my addiction, examine the choices that I made, examine the grief I had experienced. And I traced and traced and traced all the way back to 11 years old, when I experienced the hardest trauma, the first trauma. And when I traced all of these life's experiences back to 11, that's when I realized that the addiction wasn't my problem. The addiction was just where the pain had found an outlet. So my pain that I had experienced then and through other events in my life, it was coming out in my behavior. It was coming out in decisions I was making. It was coming out in addiction, the things that I turned to. It was coming out in relationships that were dysfunctional. And it was pouring over into every aspect of my life. But again, as I was examining these things, then I was able to change my mind about some things. Instead of continuing to focus on the things that happened to me, the choices that I had made, they became the prevailing item that I was focusing on. I was able to sit and say, not what happened to me, but what were the choices that I made after what happened to me. Now, don't get me wrong. That does not minimize the responsibility for the harm that was done to me, both at 11 years old, because no child should ever feel responsible for harm that is inflicted upon them. I did not cause that man to shoot me that day. I was not responsible for the accident my daughter got into that took her life. But when I started realizing there were choices that I could make in the present day, I realized there was power that I had given up to all these people, all these events in my life, and I could take that power back, and it was mine. I could then take charge of my future and where I went on from there. There's a question of transformation that most people ask. And that question is, well, Tonia, what caused you to have this ability to transform? Were you just lucky? No, I wasn't lucky. But it's true that one person can be exposed to addiction. They could go into rehabs. They can be exposed to incarceration, which is a trauma all in itself. They can lose loved ones. They can be abused. So why does one rise up and another fall and succumb to the pressure of those situations? Mindset. Thank you. It is the mindset. Now, the brain continues to be a mystery to me even today. One thing I know, though, is you can retrain the brain. And I didn't study this anywhere. I didn't go sit in a library during COVID and read as many books as I could. I didn't listen to a motivational podcast and suddenly become inspired. Every single word that comes out of my mouth is because it's lived experience. I would not be before you today if I had not lived it, walked it out, and found that there's some truth in what I've experienced and where I've gone with it. So while I sat in that 6x9 jail cell and I peeled back the layers of my life and started answering the hard questions, at that point, I realized that I had a purpose. I fell to my knees in that jail cell and I said, I'm not trying to get out of this situation that I'm in today. Because see, there were other times that I was locked up. And those times I had always hired an attorney. I had tried to get out on bond. I had said, God, just get me out of this situation. And guess what? Tomorrow will be different. I'll change this time. Not this time. This time, I said, I'm not trying to get out. Just change me. Change me this time while I'm here. So change me he did, and still changing me he is. I walked out of that jail cell, not on the day I physically came out and was released from jail. But guess what? I walked out of incarceration the day I turned my will and emotions over to God. Because suddenly I felt freedom, a peace within me that I had never felt my entire life. So I had a purpose now because God said, it's my burden. I cast it over onto him. He said, I didn't have to carry that on my own anymore. But I want you to carry your story and your experiences and what I have brought you through and will continue to bring you through. And I want you to take that out into the community, into other states, into other nations, into other households. And I want you to tell them how they too can rise above their circumstances. I said, okay, great. Now I know what I'm supposed to do. And purpose will give you the what. It'll often give you the why. But what it seldom does is give you the how. So I'm like, wow, God, thanks. I cast my cares upon you, but now you done put something on me. And yes, trust him, trust the process. So what I did know is that I needed a structure. If you think about a skyscraper, is a skyscraper built from the outside in, or is it built from the inside out? Inside out. Exactly. The framework, the structure is necessary. And there's a myth I want to tell you about. Have you ever heard the phrase, second chances are real. You can definitely get back everything you've lost. You just got to rebuild your life. Yeah. That's a myth. I say you don't need to rebuild your life. Because when someone says rebuild your life to me, I say, wait a minute. I don't want that lady that existed beforehand. Why would I want to rebuild something that I didn't like to begin with, that brought me nothing good to begin with? Now, don't get me wrong. There were these hills and valleys all through my life. So yes, I had an education. I had been blessed with that. I actually excelled in my professional career many times. And I say many times because self-sabotage was part of my life as well. So every time I reached a height of my profession, then it seemed like I would sabotage and I would fall down again. So I didn't want that back in my life. I didn't want that woman. So I decided to build right from where I was. But how was I going to do that? I didn't know how to do that. So I started thinking about the structure that corporations, because I was out in corporate America, I had a professional career at one point, and I said, well, how do they manage their structure? How do they succeed? Well, they certainly don't do it alone. They have a board of directors. I'm like, I didn't even need to think about this twice. God, why can't I have a board of directors over my life, over my purpose, over this mission that you gave me? Why not? So that's exactly what I did. That question ignited me creating a board of directors for my life. And the next thing that I had to do once I had that answer of, yes, I'm creating this board of directors, is I had to ask myself, well, so who's on this board? Not just who, but what's on this board? So I went through and I evaluated where are the gaps between the skills, the talents, the experiences, the abilities that I have, and where I want to go in my life, this purpose and mission that God gave me. So I identified the gaps, I identified where I needed accountability, I identified where I needed learning, and I created 5 positions. The first one being a chief operating officer. And that chief operating officer was in my life to bring strategy, strategic insight to my mission. And they were able to break it into small segments where we could take it and actually enact it in a way that brought forth impact and results. And the next thing I looked at was creating a chief marketing operator position. Now that position is not meant to shine a light on what it is I need to get across, but because I already had the what. Remember, it's the how I didn't have. So it's then that chief marketing operator position, I need some water, that chief marketing operator position in that moment needed to help me get my purpose and my message across. And I knew nothing about branding. So they were able to bring that to the table. Thank you. I knew nothing about branding. They were able to do that. And then I created a chief financial officer position. That position was my growth advisor. And in that position, they were able to help me with not just financial growth. We weren't growing my finances at that point. What we were doing was growing my legacy. They were teaching me how to be astute about the money that was in my life, about the opportunities that were in my life, and take it at a pace where I wasn't just building emotional impact, but I was building legacy. I was building changed lives was the goal of my mission. So, and then after that, I needed a spiritual advisor. Because remember, my life began its transformation because I released it over to God. So if I went out into the community as Tonia, and Tonia Garnett, Tonia that found a voice, which is Tonia Talks Now, then that's a whole lot of Tonia and not a whole lot of God. So that spiritual advisor was there to pray for me, to pray with me, to keep me grounded in my faith, that when I lost sight of, and you can quickly lose sight of who's in charge, she was able to ground me back, bring me back to the Word and say, why are you doing this? Who gave you your purpose to begin with? And then the final position on my board of directors was an emotional anchor. And that emotional anchor was someone that would remind me why it was I started doing what I was doing in the first place. Why was I out telling my story? What was the impact I wanted to make? So I don't care what level of an organization you're with, where you're at, what status in life. Everybody at some point doubts themselves. Now, if you have not doubted yourself, please raise your hand because I need to meet you right now. So that emotional anchor, that's the one that would hold me up when I doubted myself. Now, as I built this life board of directors and moved forward, I realized that, wait a minute, there's more than support around my mission that is going on here. There's actually a process that is helping me move forward, not just this board of people. And so I identified that there's a method, and I called it the Life Board Method. So this Life Board Method has 4 pillars: locate, identify, frame, and expand. Now, what do I mean by that? Because I want to take this a little slower at this point. Remember a previous slide I said to you, people say rebuild your life, and I'm like, nope, wrong, build it. So how do you build it? Well, you first need to locate where you're at. What's true around you? What's your environment? Where are your boundaries set? Where have you, become stagnant in life? Think of it this way. Those of you that came from out of town, likely you plugged in the address of Blue Stallion Leadership into your GPS. And your GPS brought you here. We've become really reliant on technology. But wait a minute, your GPS first needed to know, where were you coming from? Now, what if your GPS asked you, Patty, where are you starting from? And you said, that information's personal. You wouldn't get to your destination. You absolutely would not get there. So that's what I mean by locate. Locate exactly where you're at. Don't pretend. I had done that for so many years. I had pretended for the rooms that I walked in. I wore a mask. I became the person that I was expected to become. And that went from starting in high school, actually, at a very young age. It went on into my military career. I did serve in the United States Army for 8 years. It went on into my professional career, which I had in human resources. Now, I didn't even know how I kept getting promoted in human resources. I didn't even like it. So what I figured out is that I kept performing for every room that I was in. And because I was performing, managers around me would see something in me, something spectacular, thank you, but it wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't me. So I was living somebody else's life and somebody else's expectations. So when you locate, you're locating what's true at that moment. And then you move to the next aspect, which is identify. Identify, what are your values? What's important to you? That's the really, I think, most meaningful pillar of this aspect is that you have to lay a foundation. Where do you spend your time? That's what's important to you. Wherever you spend your time, that is honestly what's important to you, because I don't know about you, but last time I checked the clock, we all had 24 hours in one day. And so that 24 hours is spent in some way, shape, or form into the things that you want to do and want to grow in. So identify your values, identify your mission, identify your purpose. And once you have that foundation laid, you need to build a framework. Remember that building, that skyscraper I named? Well, they put up the scaffolding and they put up those strong, hopefully metal, not wood these days. They put up these strong beams and they connect them. And as they connect them, they're creating rooms that we're later going to walk into. And that frame continues, and then they start building the walls, they start laying the flooring, they put the drywall in, the painting, they do all of those things. Well, that's the framework. Your framework that you need to establish is, where do you want to go? Who do you want to be? So not who you're expected to be, but actually who you want. And once you've identified that, then you can build the frame around creating it. Expanding is the final pillar of this life board method. Now, expanding means now I've got my framework, so I've located, I've identified, I've built a frame. Now I'm going to expand. I'm going to develop my confidence. I'm going to walk into rooms I'm not expected to walk into. I'm going to practice. I'm going to live out my calling, not because it's easy, because guess what? I didn't transform because it was easy. I don't tell my truth and my past because it's easy. I do it because I'm expanding, not for me, but remember, the purpose God gave me was to tell my story, to share my experience so that I can allow others to rise above their circumstances. Well, I can't do that if I'm not practicing and stepping into rooms that you wouldn't normally expect someone with my past to step into. So this life board method, I'm only giving you teasers today, and there's a reason I'm only giving you teasers. I wrote a book, Enough is Enough, I Won't Be a Statistic. That was a self-healing and cathartic book for me. That was the beginning of my journey when I came home. Now, remember I said when I came home, because when I became free was when I released my life. When I released it, that was 1 year before I walked out of the doors to prison. Now, it has been 1 year, so it's been 2 years since I gave my life over and said, it's not that God was unknown to me, it's that I had not relaxed my will and said, I can't do this on my own. So that was 2 years ago. 1 year ago, I walked out of a jail cell. I walked out of prison. And when that happened, I began with the Life Board of Directors. I wrote the book, Enough is Enough, I Won't Be a Statistic. I wouldn't have been able to do that had I not implemented a group of people around me that could help me hone into that how. And then I realized, hey, there is a method to the madness. And that method is the Life Board method. The reason I'm only giving you teasers is because my second book comes out in September. And that book actually gets into the nuts and bolts of each pillar of this method. And right now, I will tell you that I look back at all the things that I've experienced throughout my entire life, and I look back at these couple years that I've mentioned, from 2021 with the shooting and the death of my daughter, to the incarceration, to peeling back the layers. And as I look back to all of that, I realize something, that it's not only me that rose above the circumstances. It's not only me that stepped into the hard rooms, but it's me that is forging the way because of the people rising behind me. Now, I don't know your situation. It could be a marriage that's failing. It could be a business that's struggling. It could be grief. It could be the things I struggled with, such as substance use, such as mental illness. No matter what your circumstance is, you're still here. And if you are still here, I assure you, you and you and you, all of us, we were meant to rise above. Thank you.